All right, well, hello everybody and welcome to our Grow Native Masterclass, Native Alternatives for Invasive Trees and Shrubs and for Traditional Non-Native Herbaceous Plants with James Faupel. The Grow Native program is a native plant marketing and education program that serves the lower Midwest, run by the Missouri Prairie Foundation. My name is Brooke Widmar. I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this week's Masterclass. Check out our lineup of masterclasses and free webinars for the rest of February and into March at grownative.org. I do want to take a moment to recognize and thank Grow Native sponsors listed here on the screen. Their support makes educational opportunities like this one possible. So during the presentation, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A section. There will be a quick moment for questions halfway through the presentation as sort of a check-in. Then we'll have more time at the end for the rest of your questions where Carol will come on and read them out to James. The webinar is being recorded. The link will be shared with all of you tomorrow along with the resources mentioned during the presentation. So to introduce today's speaker, James Faupel works at the Litzinger Road Ecology Center after previously working with the Missouri Botanical Garden. He supervises the management of its reconstructed prairies and restored woodlands, manages the research and monitoring that happens on site, and participates in community outreach on many ecological and horticultural topics in the St. Louis region. James is a trained horticulturist and ISA trained arborist, and he's been professionally trained in field botany as well as bee identification. His many years of horticultural experience and his background ranging from nursery work, traditional landscape maintenance and design, habitat restoration, as well as formal botanical garden propagation and maintenance gives him a unique behind-the-scenes perspective and understanding of how the landscape industry works as a whole and its long-lasting effects on our urban environments. So without further ado, take it away, James.
All right, thank you, Brooke. So let's go here. So back up just a second here. So the title of this talk is a bit of a mouthful, just trying to cover a lot of ground in this masterclass about alternatives, native plant alternatives to both invasive species that are trees, so and shrubs, so woody plants, and then exotic herbaceous plants that are common in the horticultural trade. And we'll kind of delve deeper into that as we get to that point. And this, with being this a master class, we expect that most people have probably already know a lot about native plants and like why we should be using them. But just as a brief overview here at the very beginning, I'll kind of breeze through, why we should be using them, just not try to spend too much time on that. All right. And so why should we be using them? Really, it's because it's the right thing to do. These plants provide food and shelter for our local wildlife. It's just incredibly important habitat for them that we have been removing slowly over a long period of time. In our urban areas, especially, we've removed so much native vegetation, and then of course we're bringing in a lot of exotic plants into these areas. And so with that, in these urban areas, whether it be, just compact, dense populated areas with lots of blacktop and concrete and small garden spaces to, vast, seas of lawn grass, it's not very useful for wildlife. And some of these plants that we brought into these types of man-made habitats have now become invasive, and they're escaping and outcompeting native plants in those remaining wild areas that we have. And so something like this is very common around St. Louis. This is bush honeysuckle. It is a plant from Asia, and it just gets into a understory of a woodland and just outcompetes everything. And it just outshades them. It outcompetes them with chemicals in its roots. And phenology wise, it outcompetes them because it leaves out first and it's the last thing to drop its leaves. So there's many factors that go into these plants being able to outcompete our native plants, but just knowing and understanding their value in our habitats is another step of that. And so that's what I want everybody to think about while we're talking about all these different alternatives to non-natives and invasives is that really when I drive by a woodland like you just saw, and you just see nothing but bush honeysuckle, and maybe there's exotic winter creeper planted on, growing underneath that has escaped as well. To the wildlife and even to me just driving by, this is what I see. It's not something that's supposed to be there. It's something we've kind of discarded from our properties, and it's not useful to wildlife, just as this sea of debris, this plastic debris is. And so some of the reasons we would be wanting to use native plants would be their natural beauty, the economics of it, so like just the cost of maintaining them, the environmental footprint that we're using with them, so that water use and chemical use that we're trying to avoid in using them, the educational experience that we can gain by using them, children getting out and learning about nature, because in our urban areas, kids are growing up seeing that bush honeysuckle and things like that, and they think that's what nature is, and that is not what it is. So us, taking those plants out, putting back native plants is going to be a highly educational experience for many people. And of course, they're very entertaining and exciting with all the wildlife they attract. One of my mentors in school here in St. Louis was Dave Tilka, and he wrote a book about native landscaping for wildlife and people. It's a great book if you can get it used online, but I highly recommend that. But one of his catchphrases always was, native plants add spice to life. And I just really like that. Like I said, that natural beauty, this is where I worked previously for the Botanical Garden before moving to the Litzinger Road Ecology Center. This is Shaw Nature Reserve and the Wildflower Garden there. And almost everything that you see at the Wildflower Garden and what you see in this picture here are native plants. So it's just totally beautiful if you learn how to use them properly and how to garden with them. And, most of you probably already know this, we're using these because the animals, the wildlife use these plants. So would this bother you if this was in your yard, seeing that foliage chewed up? Hopefully not, because that's a little spice bush caterpillar inside there making his home and, eating that leaf. It is solely dependent upon that plant and sassafras. It eats 2 plants in the St. Louis area. And so if you didn't have spice bush or sassafras, its other host plant, you would not get this beautiful butterfly in our area. And so another part of that, if you're hearing about caterpillars and herbivory, you've probably heard about Doug Tallamy and his work, his book Bringing Nature Home, and his newest book Nature's Best Hope. And out of his work, out of the University of Delaware, he has brought in a lot of new information about caterpillars. So Lepidoptera and moth caterpillars, Lepidoptera are butterfly and moth caterpillars. So I'm not going to make you read this whole list here, but just to know that he's got this great list of the Lepidoptera of the eastern United States and their host plants. In each of these genuses, how many Lepidoptera the caterpillars they actually support. So like right there at the top, you see the oaks at 557. These numbers are going to be important to my talk here in just a little bit when I'm getting into the native plants that will be good replacements for some invasive trees and shrubs. So just know that that list exists out there and you can find that. And if on my screen it's covered up, so hopefully it's not covered up too much on yours, but it's 96% of terrestrial birds in North America rely on feeding their young insects. So hopefully you're starting to see those pieces put together now of all those caterpillars that are eating those plants. And there's going to be birds reliant upon those caterpillars and other insects, soft-bodied insects like beetle grubs. So 96% of them, though, have to raise their young on insects, so protein. They can't raise their young on seeds. And a big part of Doug Tallamy's study that has, kind of made waves for people because it's such an eye-opening number. Oops. Is that the chickadees that they were studying were bringing back 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise just one clutch of chickadees. So it's a staggering amount of insects that have to be provided to, raise just one clutch of birds. And then, you just got to stack that up on top of just all these other birds that we have around here. They're just completely reliant on this. And then, of course, the next link in the food web is going to be, decided upon by those lower choices, right? So the plant choices we make will affect the entire food web. And so we're just looking at the caterpillars here when we talk about like Doug Tallamy's work. And so that's just looking at one little line in the food web. There's going to be just so many other lines coming from this. And native plants are going to be providing for more than just those Lepidoptera caterpillars. 90% of all those caterpillars are, or sorry, 90% of all herbivorous insects are specialists. So they are reliant upon either some, like that spicebush swallowtail caterpillar that I showed you earlier, that is reliant upon just two plants. Some of these specialists are reliant on a whole group. So if you're familiar with the monarchs, they can eat most all plants within the genus Asclepius. So they're able to eat milkweeds. So they're reliant on a whole suite of plants. So 90% of herbivorous insects, though, are specialists. They're reliant on a group to just a few plants. And then that other number you see there, that 25%, is our native bees to the eastern United States. So 25% of our bees are specialists. They require either a suite of plants or just a handful of plants that they can only visit to get pollen from, because bees are raising their young on pollen. So they're essentially vegetarians, just like those caterpillars. They're eating parts of the plant. So it's very important to also think about that in the sense of why we don't want to use pesticides on plants. Because even if you're putting in a systemic pesticide, it's going to be taken up by the plant, and it's going to be put into most parts of the plant material. So just to bring it home just a little bit more local to St. Louis and the Missouri area, there's 450 plus species of bees known to our state. And according to Mike Arduzer, a former member of the Missouri Department of Conservation who's retired, but was one of our state's best bee specialists, is that 225 of those species are oligolectic. So those are specialist bees. So bees that are relying upon plants to be there for them to exist. And the one you see here in this picture is a bee that is a specialist on spring beauties. So if you do not have spring beauties in your yard, you're not going to be able to attract this bee. And if there's no spring beauties anywhere in your area, because we've sprayed them out of lawns, etc., you're not going to have this bee. We've really diminished the area that this bee can survive in. And so just things to really think about. 225 bees are really reliant on us to have certain species of plants still in existence for them. And so what can one person really accomplish on their tiny piece of property, James? What can I actually do? Well, I'm glad you asked that. So one of our Wild One members here in St. Louis, Dawn Weber, she has a city lot. It's a 1/4 acre, and it's landscaped robustly with 300 species of native plants. And that may seem like a really big number to you. She's been doing it for quite a while now, probably 10 plus years. And, so she's been able to build up to that many species. I wouldn't say start off with that, for sure. But she's able to do it in a very, nice manner. And it's in the front yard and the backyard. It's very well kept looking. She's still got turf grass. She's got a really nice landscaped yard. But her yard supports at least 100 species of birds, 39 species of butterflies, 23 plus species of bees, and 15 species of odonata. Those are damselflies and dragonflies. So that 23 plus species of bees that you see there, why it has the plus, is because it's really hard to identify bees to species. So really, we've only been able to find in her yard just 23 species. There might actually be more than that if we were looking a lot closer, capturing the bees and looking at them under a microscope. So she's doing a fantastic job on just a 1/4 acre city lot. And I'm in no way a purist. I've got about 75% native plant material in my yard, and it's probably hidden on yours if my picture is in front of it there, but one of Doug Talmey's students, she did research showing that in a yard, to be able to sustain those chickadee populations, you need about 70%. So they were studying chickadees specifically, but you need 70% native plant material in your yard to be able to sustain those populations. And so they were doing surveys throughout in a very tight urban area. And like I said, I'm not a purist. I got my hostas. I got my Chinese variegated dogwood that's got the really showy foliage here. It doesn't produce fruit. And, I've got my non-native annuals I put in pots every year to be really flashy and, be very colorful for those times of the year that those native plants aren't showing up for anything. And so without further ado, I'm going to hop into the next section here, the main reason you came to see this, and that's replacing invasive trees and shrubs here in this first section. And then I'm going to hop into that other section after a brief Q&A in the middle. And so just a throwback to that 225 species real quick of bees that are specialists here in Missouri. Of woody plants, the bees that specialize on woody plants that we could make choices to have in our yards are things like dogwoods, cherries, willows, blueberries, and gooseberries. Those are the host plants for a lot of our specialist bees that rely on woody plants. That's not a very big part of them. A majority of those 225 are relying on herbaceous plants to exist. All right. Probably, enemy number one when it comes to invasive trees in Missouri is Callery pear, or a lot of people might know the cultivar Bradford pear. And that's just one cultivar of the Callery pears. And so they're those nicely shaped, egg-shaped trees with nice glossy foliage, nice white flowers in springtime. Right after the leaves have started coming out, they produce those flowers. They smell pretty awful. And they produce fruit that birds do eat and carry off. And so they spread around those seeds. This plant is still sold in nurseries. It's a very popular plant. The Bradford pear is hard to find anymore, that cultivar, because of it splitting apart. But that's also one of the problems. Once that started splitting apart, we started bringing in all these cultivars of Bradford pear that could then start really cross-pollinating with each other and producing viable seed. And you can still find all these kind of cultivars in nurseries, and it's not a very nice plant. It'll grow these very stubby, short stems that'll be quite thorn-like. And that's not something that you would see on any of the cultivars, but once they've hybridized and have gone back out into the wild, they're producing basically genetics from their grandparents and beyond. So they're pulling those genetics out. And there you can see those glossy leaves that people like, and that, that wonderful white flower color that they have. As people whiz by these along the highway and they're like, oh, what's that tree blooming? Well, it's Callery pear, and it's outcompeting many other plants. I mean, it's just, ruining habitat like that. And it's one that really hops into open grassland areas. So it's not a friend to our prairies. And probably my favorite replacement for that is serviceberry. And it's this beautiful four-season plant. It's got these beautiful white flowers in springtime that are great for pollinators. Very important for our queen bumblebees, of which we have 6 species in Missouri. And those queens are reliant upon us having nectar sources and pollen sources for them to start their colonies first thing in spring. Serviceberry is one of those. It's got that beautiful flower color in spring. It's got this beautiful bark that those multiple trunks for a wintertime show. During the summertime, it's got these berries that are edible. Just make sure you beat the birds to them. And then that gorgeous fall color. Now, this one I got the scientific name up there because there's a lot of service berries out there in the trades, but specifically native to Missouri is Amelanchier arborea. That is our native species, and I highly recommend you trying to find our straight native species because a lot of nurseries that are selling service berries are service berries from like eastern United States that aren't necessarily, quite native to here. But service berries in general as a genus support 124 Lepidoptera caterpillars. So that's what that number is you see there next to service berry. That's a throwback to that Doug Ptolemy numbers I was talking about. So service berries as a genus in the eastern United States supports 124 Lepidoptera species. And there's one of our queen bumblebees visiting those in spring. Flowering dogwood, which is Cornus florida. It is a fantastic early spring bloomer. Again, nice replacement for that in the way that it has that same kind of red fall color that Bradford pear is going to have. And it's got even showier flowers, in my opinion. And of course, it's supporting 118 Lepidoptera caterpillars in the eastern United States. And its dogwoods are supporting specialist bees as well. And there you can see its fruits that support a lot of birds. And that beautiful fall color. Another tree that's got a nice shape. It's going to be bigger than a Callery pear in the long run. This is going to be a shade tree, but it's very slow growing. So if you wanted a tree that's going to get to be bigger over time, but still have a nice shape to it for quite a while, is our native black gum, Nyssa sylvatica. And that supports 26 species of Lepidoptera in the eastern United States. This one, I would argue, has probably got one of the best fall color shows of probably any of our native trees, really. It can have some just really fiery knockout fall color. Green hawthorn is another that's very similar to the look of a Callery pear, from its leaves to its flowers, to its fruits, to its bark. This one is one of the few hawthorns that doesn't get rust that bad at all. And it's, just a stellar tree. And as you can see, though, when I go back here, 168 species of Lepidoptera in the eastern United States. So you're hopefully seeing just the value even just out of that. But then thinking about all the other things that are reliant upon this tree as well, from birds to bees. Mexican plum, if you saw that specialist bee slide earlier, that was saying cherries are plums, which we have a lot of native plums here in Missouri. Those are in the same genus as cherries, so that's Prunus, and they support up to 456 species of Lepidoptera in the eastern United States. They're not, our native cherries are not used enough in horticulture, and they are so important to so many different types of life. Such an important food source for queen bumblebees again, but many specialist bees rely on cherries as well. The rusty blackhaw viburnum, it is not a tree in the sense of getting to be like the same scale of a Callery pear. It's more of a large shrub, or you can train it up into a small tree. But it's going to have that great glossy fall color. or red fall color, but there's great glossy leaves and some really wonderful bark and multiple trunks, and again, fruit and Lepidoptera and bees that are reliant upon these. All right, so that's just the calorie pair. Those are a lot of great suggestions to replace that one. The mimosa tree is another ornamental invasive that we have in Missouri. You typically don't see this sold in nurseries, but you see a lot of people planting it in their lawns. I mean, it'll pop up probably in your own garden beds and stuff if you just, keep an eye out for it. But a lot of people like this tree. It is not that beneficial at all to wildlife, but it does spread out into the wild. And some just good replacements for this because it's kind of a unique flower, a unique shape to the tree, and that's generally why people like it, because it's got this kind of exotic look to it. Some of our natives that would be similar to it, well, redbud's one of them. It's going to have a similar kind of fanned out shape, and it's another legume just like the mimosa tree. And it supports 19 species of Lepidoptera, as you see there, but another early spring pollinator magnet. It's just one of those trees that it's just going to be buzzing with life if you go stand underneath it in springtime on a nice warm day. And a very important one. It is used quite a lot, but it's going to fit that bill if you want that kind of shape to the tree, but it's not the same bloom time. One that would be similar to that kind of fuzzy, kind of smoky look as the mimosa and a little bit later bloom time is the American fringe tree. It's not supporting that many Lepidoptera, but that's not really as big a deal as you would think, because of those ones that actually are reliant upon it still require it, right? It doesn't matter that it's not helping out 400 species, it's still doing more than a mimosa ecologically. Another one, American smoke tree, again, kind of very low on that Lepidoptera support, but there's pollinators that are reliant upon this in existence too. And very cool, smoky look to those flowers, showier than the mimosa in my opinion. And it's got fantastic fall color, which the mimosa does not have. Yellowwood is a native tree that again has a kind of a unique flower shape to it that would be kind of more exotic looking. The trunk of this tree is really big and smooth. It's got lots of leaflets to each individual leaf like the mimosa, and it's another legume, so it'll give you kind of that same appearance and shape, overall shape of the plant, and a little bit of a unique flower shape. But from what we know, there is no Lepidoptera caterpillars associated with this one. But when it comes to pollinators, they will be visiting this plant. All right, shrubs. This one I'm going to kind of do in as a batch. A lot of our invasive shrubs here in Missouri are not necessarily horticulturally used still. A lot of them are being used now supplementally as a screening. And when I say that, it's things like bush honeysuckle that are really very common around our urban areas and have become just these screens that people are not willing to take out anymore because now it's blocking their view of their neighbor, or maybe something unsightly in the neighbor's yard, things like that. They just don't want to see anybody. They just want their little secluded yard. And so there's native plants that can do that if you remove the bush honeysuckle. The same thing goes for autumn olive. And I'm not going to get into ID. This isn't an ID class for invasive species. But just so you can see just some of these plants that I'm referring to that people are almost not willing to remove just because of that screening sense. Burning bush is one that is still horticulturally sold. And I'll come back to this one here in just a little bit. But this one is escaping more and more around our urban areas. Privets are really bad and way worse to remove than bush honeysuckle. Japanese knotweeds showing up a lot more. This is a plague out east. It's not quite like bush honeysuckle, that picture you see on the lower left there. That's actually just one big, probably one individual plant, because it spreads by underground roots and it just becomes a colony. And so it becomes more of a pain to remove in a sense once you let it go too long. And barberries, they are still horticulturally sold. There's not a lot of native plants that I can recommend without it being a cultivar that are going to have like the purple leaves that people really look at for barberries. But barberries are escaping more and more too. This is a shot from Illinois. And where I work at the Litzinger Road Ecology Center, last year we actually just cut out 5 Japanese barberries for the first time. So they're starting to show up in our area, but they're heavily used in the area, that rural area right around us, or a suburban area right around us. I mean, buckthorns is a really bad one in certain areas of Missouri, but a very horrible one up near like Chicago. This is their bush honeysuckle up there. But at Shaw Nature Reserve, there was plenty of buckthorns that we were removing out there in Franklin County. All right, so some good native plants that can be in these woodland settings that can be a nice screen. They're not necessarily a foundation planting shrub that I'm talking about, but none of those plants that I previously showed really were, aside from maybe Japanese barberry. But that's not the habitat that it's really escaping into. It's not just really popping up in people's yards, it's escaping out into woodlands. So 9-bark is a really great one. See there, it's supporting 41 species of Lepidoptera in the eastern United States. It's a pollinator magnet when it is in bloom. It's another member of the Rosaceae family. And the Rosaceae family just supports so much insect life. And this one would be for a drier woodland setting. Same goes for this one. This is a little bit drier woodland setting. You're going to see this in more upland woodlands. This is aromatic sumac, Rhus aromatica, and the sumacs support 58 species of Lepidoptera in the eastern United States. This one specifically is a little bit more manageable than some of the other sumacs, so it's a better one for a smaller piece of property versus the other sumacs, which are more open settings, which are primarily more like prairie or open grassland kind of species. This one has fantastic fall color. Its early spring blooms are very important for pollinators. A unique set of pollinators actually visit some of these flowers. And this on the left there is a andrina that visits a lot of our just very early woodland spring blooms, and it's a mining bee that's mimicking bumblebees. So if it looks like a bumblebee to you, it's actually quite a bit smaller, but it's got that same coloration as our bumblebees. And spicebush blooms right about the same time as the aromatic sumac I just showed you. And it's got these beautiful yellow blooms. So very early, supporting a lot of pollinators, and it's going to be more for bottomlands. So whereas the aromatic sumac was for a drier site condition, if you have a wetter condition where you're removing like bush honeysuckle, this is a good one for that. Bush honeysuckle doesn't seem to really care. At Litzinger Road Ecology Center, it's both a bottomland species and an upland species. Bush honeysuckle will just take over any kind of open woodland you have, unless it's probably just a standing floodplain. But ours is just temporary one, so it does get to drain occasionally. But so that's why the spicebush love that area. But we have to really, stay on top of removing that bush honeysuckle. And it's got beautiful yellow fall color if it's in a more sunnier spot. If it's in a densely wooded area where it's got more shade, you're not going to get as good a fall color as you see in that picture there. And the female plants of this produce lots of berries that the birds just devour very quickly. And this is also that host plant for the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar that I showed you earlier on in the presentation. Some pollinators, not just bees are pollinators. So Ants will be visiting this, beetles will be visiting this, moths, butterflies, all kinds of things. Hazelnut. This is another one for a more moist woodland setting, and it supports 131 Lepidoptera species, and it produces these nuts that birds and small mammals like squirrels are going to go crazy for. If you wanted to try and get some of those hazelnuts, good luck beating the squirrels to them. You'll have to try and protect them. And this is not a big pollinator plant. It is wind pollinated, so you're not getting that benefit in this one. But the other sources for wildlife, like those nuts, are very important. But it supports a lot of Lepidoptera, and it actually has a really beautiful, like bronzy fall color here. Gray dogwood is another. This one kind of treads the line in between dry to moist, so it's a little bit more versatile. And it's those dogwoods, the roughleaf dogwood and a swamp dogwood. Those are other good choices too for these settings. I just put this one in, but dogwoods are incredibly important for those bees, the specialist bees we were talking about. There's quite a few specialist bees on dogwood species, and 119 Lepidoptera caterpillars are supported in the eastern United States, and the birds go gaga over their berries. And quite beautiful flowers, even though they're not as showy as the flowering dogwood tree. All right, and black chokeberry. It's a smaller shrub. It's not going to get to the giant sizes of like gray dogwood, but it can still be pretty big. Very important pollinator plant. 6 species of Lepidoptera in the eastern United States. And these berries that the birds are again gonna love you for. Willow was another one that's very important for specialist bees. 455 species of Lepidoptera caterpillars supported by it in the eastern United States. It's one of the very first things to bloom woody plant wise in our area. And it's probably the smallest out of any of the willows that you might be able to find in a nursery. So for your own yard area, this is probably going to be the most ideal one for you. And it's going to want a little bit sunnier conditions. So you'd want to put it a little bit farther away from the woodland edge if you were removing bush honeysuckle. So if you were wanting it as that screen replacement, you're going to want to push it a little bit out. All right, trying to move along here. Witch hazels, another great one. 63 species of Lepidoptera. Ozark witch hazel is the one that blooms here in spring. It's blooming right now. And the eastern witch hazel is the one that blooms back in November and December. And I wanted to throw in one evergreen for you. This is going to be a tree. But again, if you wanted some kind of good screening to replace those kind of shrubs, American holly is a great one. Still supports a lot of Lepidoptera caterpillars, and very important for pollinators and those birds. All right, jumping back real quick to the burning bush. This one's still horticulturally used, primarily for that beautiful red fall color it has. But again, it's not very good for our environment. It's escaping, and hardly anything is using it. We have 2 native euonymus, the eastern wahoo, which has some really great fall color, and you can see their fruits too are really interesting, just like the strawberry bush, our other native euonymus. Both these are great replacements in the sense of getting that fall color, and for if you really like that fruit that sets up on euonymus. It's a really unique fruit. All right, so let's stop it right there for a quick Q&A on part 1. If anybody's got questions about the trees and shrubs before we move on to the herbaceous plants.
Thank you, James. This is Carol David. I'm Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and we do have a number of questions. Some are not just about shrubs and trees, so I will go through the shrubs and trees first, but then maybe we could touch on some of the other ones too.
Okay.
There were a couple questions about the botanical name of green hawthorn.
Yes. Oh, man. The end of the day. It's Crataegus. I think it's a viridiflora.
I can try to Google it too.
So Crataegus is the hawthorn genus. And I want to say maybe it's like viridiflora or viridis.
Tell you what, I'll check on that and I'll put it in the chat later to verify. When you're talking about sumac, Jill asked, is that the same as fragrant sumac?
Yes. Yeah, aromatic and fragrant sumac are two the same common names for that same plant.
Great. How do prairie willows spread?
So prairie willows typically don't spread much by roots. They will layer. So if a branch lays down on the ground and gets covered up by a little bit of soil, or if it's laying like right on the soil level, it'll root in so it can start spreading out like that. Or it can spread readily by seed if the setting is right. So it would have to be really moist conditions when the plant is going to seed. So it can pop up, kind of all over the place if we had a nice wet condition for it. But it would have to be like a adaptable soil for it. Typically it's living in prairies, a little bit drier conditions. I've not seen it. So when I worked with that plant at Shaw Nature Reserve, we had, mulched beds where it was at in two big plantings, and it would never reseed just because it was not that right kind of conditions for it. But we could easily grab the seeds off of the plant, throw it right on the top of some potting mix in a tray, wet it down, and it starts germinating immediately. So that's how most willows are able to germinate. They need that moisture on that immediate contact.
Great, thanks. Sherry Ann put in the chat Crataegus viridis for the green hawthorn. There's also a question about the scientific name for Mexican plum. I think it's Prunus mexicana.
Correct.
Right? Okay. Very good. What's the best way to keep a seedling black gum to help it survive in a windy prairie setting?
In a windy prairie setting. So, I mean, I can't imagine that if it was planted as a young tree, you're probably not going to have too many issues because, I mean, it's very tolerant of, our weather conditions here. I've not seen it ever really have issues with limbs breaking. It's a fairly slow growing tree, so it'll adapt to wind conditions over time. But one thing you could do if you actually are having issues with it would be you could probably thin it out a little bit, as it's growing, doing some preemptive pruning to allow for more arid flow through it. But I would think that it would probably kind of self-prune on its own in a windy setting if it was started as a young tree. If you started it as a larger specimen out there, then you might actually be having some issues. But I can't see that you would probably have too many issues in the long run with that tree. It's a pretty tough tree. It doesn't drop branches easily.
Right. This is a question referring to a photo you had of service berries. Are those service berries in your picture pruned up a certain way to highlight that lovely gray bark?
Yes, they are. So they will, if allowed, they will be more shrub-like in nature. But typically, if you're buying a nursery stock tree, it's probably already maybe pruned up a little bit. But typically, in a lot of garden settings where we're planting underneath them, you're going to probably want to limb it up. But if you're planting it out in the open, let it limb down. It's going to be, a more fantastic show. You're going to get more berries. You're going to be having more flowers for bees. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Does the prairie willow bloom before the witch hazel? When does the prairie willow bloom in St. Louis?
So the Ozark witch hazel is going to be the first one to bloom. This year's actually the earliest I've ever seen Ozark witch hazel bloom in St. Louis. It actually bloomed in the first week of January. The prairie willow is usually going to be just the very first spring bloomer. So as we just start to really get out of winter and into those springtime temperatures, it's going to start blooming. So typically late February, early March, really depending on the Missouri weather that we're having.
Thank you. Question about just azaleas. There, of course, we just have one species of native azalea. Can you speak about that, James?
The native azalea, it's very hard to grow. It's a very slow growing plant. if you can buy one from a nursery, which seems like it's kind of hard to find anyways, you're going to want that soil condition. So it likes acidic soil, and that's typically just certain areas of the Ozark region where there's like lots of sandstone or lots of granite underlying rock. So stuff like in the St. Francis Mountains, that's kind of the ideal habitat. If you're trying to grow it outside of there in Missouri, it might be kind of just a slow death for the plant. Either that or you're gonna have to do some supplemental treatments to your soil, which, that's kind of what we're, kind of going against with the native plant movement, is just trying to work with the plants that are native to your area. So yes, it is beautiful. It is native to our state, but it's only native to like a certain area. Very slow growing, very picky. But if you are in that region, definitely grow it. It is probably one of the most beautiful flowers in the state, in my opinion. And it does actually have a specialist bee that requires that plant.
James, there are so many more questions, but we're already almost at 4:50. So I think maybe you should go on with the rest of your presentation, and then we will get through as many of these other questions as we can.
Yep. And, with the masterclass thing, I anticipated this, it's a tough topic trying to get both these in. As long as everybody else is willing, I'm willing to go beyond that, hour time limit by just a little bit. So yeah, I'll start trying to truck through this next part here. All right. So the native alternatives to traditional exotic perennials. And so that's going to include a few invasives. There we go. And so unlike a lot of those trees and shrubs and vines that become invasive in our area, most of these plants that you see that are herbaceous and invasive have become from like agricultural uses, like they were grown for food, or they were grown for, forage plants for animals, things like that. Most of the horticultural available perennials out there aren't, escaping people's yards, at least here in Missouri. That's not the same for across the country. So why would I focus on this? That's because kind of what we've been talking about this whole time, right? The fact that we're trying to use plants that are the most ecologically friendly. So even though these plants aren't yet problematic or invasive, they are not necessarily being useful, in a sense, to wildlife. And so these plants I'm going to show you here are going to be suggestions for the best native replacements for some of these most common non-native garden plants, and trying to give you suggestions for most closely aligning them for those desirable traits that we're using them for. So things like growing conditions, bloom times, and their colors, and then the shapes and sizes or textures. All right, so Russian sage. It's a full sun plant that people love. They love that little shrubby texture to it, shrubby structure to it, sorry, the silvery foliage, and it's just as tough as nails. You can grow in some really garbage soil. And lead plant is a prairie species here to Missouri, can grow in full sun, has that silvery foliage, similar spiky purple flowers, blooms around about the same time, and it's just a full sun plant. It's a little bit slow growing, so you got to give it some time. And if it's a small little plant, things like rabbits might eat it on you, so you need to protect it for those first few stages. But it's worth the work to get a mature plant of this. One of my favorite plants in the state. But again, a little bit of work's going to have to go into it if you want a nice replacement for that. And hostas, right? Everybody's got hostas. I got hostas. But why are we using them? Large foliage, shade, dry conditions. Our native plants ain't got this big palette of different colors like you see in front of you, of foliage. So trying to switch it up a little bit, how can we work with this? How can we get some, interesting looks to the ground covers? This photo you see in front of you is like, hardly anything's eating that. Some slugs and some deer. If you have deer in the area, you're going to come in there. But this person obviously has got a fence around their yard. to have that kind of show with hostas. But so Solomon's seal, which is another member of the lily family, just like the hostas that you saw. Coral bells, which you see here in this picture here on the left. It's the Solomon seals above and the heuchera below. And so it's even offering that differing contrast and texture. That's one thing that we can do is really work with textures to try and change up the show, right? And replacement of the colors. Really try and work with different textures. The Solomon's plume here on the right, and then May apples here on the right, and then wild ginger here on the left at the base of this tree. All these plants are great ground covers for a shady area with different textures to the leaves, and they can spread pretty well and take up a spot. So the only ones that are more similar to hostas that I just showed, let me just go back, are the heucheras, which are more clump forming. So those ones aren't going to spread on their own. The rest of these plants are actually going to spread by roots and take over small patches of area. But they're great, big, striking foliage like a hosta, and you just need to work with some different textures to try and get that different show. So unfortunately, we can't do all of that wild, crazy colors that the leaves are of hostas, but again, those aren't offering benefits to wildlife. Stella daylilies, full sun, tough soil conditions. Everybody likes sticking these out by like a mailbox or somewhere. Just a tough plant, right? You can stick it in the ground, not worry about it, and it's going to bloom up this yellow color. Well, what are some plants like that we have native wise? And trying to mix up maybe some textures and shapes, maybe using both Mexican hat and lance leaf coreopsis. Both of these are going to be that short, same kind of stature as the Stella Day or daylily, and they're going to have that same kind of buttery yellow color. And if you're using both of them, you can really fill in a spot really well. They're both pretty tough plants, just like the Stella daylilies. Tulips and daffodils, we love using these for those spring blooms, but these plants offer very little for wildlife. One of the most interesting things about these that actually are beneficial to wildlife is that these blooms come up in such early time of the year that they can be little heat tubes, essentially, just like little heating rooms for bees. You actually see some of our native bees visit these flowers, not to actually nectar or get pollen from, but actually just to warm up on a cold day. So it's actually beneficial to sometimes use them in your garden somewhere, just in like one or two spots. So you can have that color, but they can also be a little heating area because they're such a big bloom and the sun really radiates within there. There's been some nice studies on that about the temperatures inside these flower heads. But aside from that, what can we do to stop just, these big mass plantings of tulips and daffodils? What can we do that's going to be more beneficial? Well, celandine poppy and bluebells are a great combo for the really early spring. It's going to be just a little bit later than the daffodils and tulips. Or actually, it's probably going to be about the same time as the tulips, but it's going to be a little bit later than the daffodils. But so these are very early spring blooms, but a great combo and very important for early pollinators, like our queen bumblebees again. And just a little bit later than them, another great combo of that same color is the wild blue indigo and golden alexander. These two are going to be able to be in more full sun, whereas the celandine poppy and the bluebells that I just showed you are more for a woodland. So if you needed that kind of blast of early spring color and it's in a sunnier spot, these are two great ones to do in a full sun area where you might have had tulips or daffodils. Stilbees, people love these for the being in the shade, large spikes of blooms. This one is one of the white color ones. I'm not gonna be able to give you something that can do the pink or the purples, things like that. But two native plants that work in the shade, they're gonna be a little bit bigger than the Astilbes, but still have that same kind of look that you're going for in the shade. So big spiky flowers and kind of that more mounded round foliage. And that's goat's beard and black cohosh, both important for pollinators early on in the season. Well, actually, I guess I should say more like mid-spring season. All right, later on in the season, people love using stone crop, just like the Stella daylilies. It's a short little mounded perennial. You can kind of throw it in any little spot, you know, and it'll grow. You can throw it on probably top of concrete and it'll grow if it has just a little patch of soil around its roots. So it's a tough plant. It's full sun and late season blooms, and it's generally that kind of pink to purple color that you'll find some of the cultivars for it in. And so two great ones that are native that are going to bloom just maybe a little bit earlier than that is the liatris, the dwarf liatris, Liatris sundracea, and purple prairie clover, Dahlia purpurea. And so both of those in a combination would be a great replacement for a little planting of those sedums. They're very small plants, but they're going to have that same similar color, very short in stature, and very tough plants, and can grow in some tough soil conditions. Peonies, why do people love them? They are full sun. They have that kind of small shrubby structure to them. You know, they do die back unless you have one of the oriental peonies that have just like the little bit of tree form. They call them tree peonies. And so the most part, they're going to have that, you know, dying back nature every year. So they are a perennial, an herbaceous plant. And, you know, they just kind of fill up a nice little chunk of area, but they got these big blooms, you know, come in a whole host of colors. So I'm not going to be able to give you a replacement for every one of those little details. But if you want that same kind of look with some natives, these are some great ones for full sun condition. So New Jersey tea and the blue stars. So that's shining blue star or the threadleaf blue stars. That's Amsonia illustris and ciliata. Ciliata is a little bit slow to grow from, you know, the starting. If you get a really small plant, it can take you a little bit. So know that, but it's well worth the wait. It's one of the earliest plants I've ever seen monarch's nectar at on their trip north. It's one of the first blooms that I've seen them stop at because it blooms earlier than the shining blue star. And it's, you know, just, I mean, you can see there in that hedge shot of that, it's just a really great looking plant. And then New Jersey tea, I know a lot of people have issues trying to grow that, but it's typically because they're trying to grow it in some pretty like really healthy soil conditions or a little bit shadier conditions. That is a prairie plant. It wants some tougher to grow in soil conditions and full sun. So make sure you're using that one in the proper situation. But both those will give you that kind of little shrubby look to it. The blue stars are herbaceous plants. The New Jersey tea actually is a woody plant, but it's very small in stature. Shasta daisy, full sun, small stature. People just love that little thing. It's very tough. You know, have it right up against the little sidewalk area. Well, a great one to replace that is robin's plantain. Very low growing ground cover, putting up these little stalks of flowers. Incredibly important for pollinators. And that one's Erigeron pacellus. And that one will spread by roots. Whereas Shasta daisy is more of a clump plant. But it's a great replacement for it if you want that white little flower color close to a sidewalk. All right, purple loosestrife. This one actually is invasive. I still see people use it. I'll see it in people's gardens from time to time. It likes wetter areas. It's pretty aggressive and will spread around. And it is invasive and will invade our wetlands. Very much one to avoid. And these pictures here remind me to bring up something I haven't yet brought up, is that people will say, but it's such a pollinator magnet. Well, actually, 3 of the bees that you'll be seeing coming to it, 3 prominent bees, are actually 3 exotic bees. So the European honeybee will be coming to it. The giant resin bee, which you see here on the right, which really only visits exotic plants. It hasn't really started going to many native plants that we have here. And then the wool carder bee here in the lower area, that one actually does visit some of our native plants. European honeybee visits pretty much everything. It's a generalist. It's not picky. But so this plant's actually supporting a lot of exotic bees and pollinators. So if you're seeing things coming to your plants, be aware that you should be trying to educate yourself on trying to recognize what actually is coming to your plants, not just saying, oh, I see all these pollinators, therefore it's doing a good job. That's not a good way to go about it. We need to be better about identifying and actually understanding what's visiting our plants. And so these are both two aggressive native plants that would grow in these same kind of conditions, big spiky flowers, but great for our native pollinators. Again, though, not something you would probably want to put in your regular pollinator garden in your yard. If you had a rain garden that's a pretty decent size, these are plants that are going to fit right in there. They're pretty aggressive and will spread in like one localized area and spread out by their roots. So they will outcompete other plants planted nearby. But again, you're replacing an invasive plant with these. Mums, late fall color, compact, variety of colors that people are wanting from them. But we need to get creative to try and replace things like this with native plants. One of those things we can use is aromatic aster. And so it'll generally bloom earlier than mums, and it's pretty compact on its own. But if you pruned it back earlier in the season to let it, kind of even dwarf it even more, it's going to push those blooms back even further. And it's not just aromatic aster that you could do this with. You could use some of the smaller cultivars of like New England aster, which has a cultivar called Purple Dome, which is nice and dwarfed. Or you could even be using some of these dwarf cultivars of goldenrods. And that's going to offer you even that yellow, which will be a great contrast color to these asters that you could use. So you can mix up those colors. You could even use these in pots. Buy a potted up plant of aromatic aster, put it in a pot, let it bloom, and then you can plant it in your yard later than that in the fall. Or you could even hold it over inside the pot, probably for at least another season or two before it's really trying to outgrow that. But so you can get more than just that single use potted plant out of there. Cannas and elephant ears, we're using these because it's full sun, very large foliage, lots of striking colors with some of the foliage sometimes. How can we get that with some native plants? Well, you're not going to get the interesting color variations like you see here, but you can get that big striking foliage to contrast against all these different textures in the garden with prairie dock. Prairie dock's a great one. It's a clump forming plant. I've used it in containers like you see here on the left, or just in the garden as a clumping plant. It will slowly start to kind of spread out. And what that just means is you can start using those in different areas or giving those off to friends. But that foliage is really cool. And if you're able to get it to flower, you can see that beautiful yellow flower there in the upper right-hand corner. All right, trying to move along here. Dianthus and creeping phlox. These are plants that we're using, for really low ground covers near a sidewalk or features that we're trying to, not block views of. Full sun, pretty tough soil conditions. Good replacements for those are rose verbena and sand phlox. Pretty much, and I'll just flash back. If I probably flash back and forth between these two slides, you probably wouldn't be able to, notice too much of a difference between them. The colors are pretty well interchangeable, but they're those native plants that are supporting lots of different diverse wildlife. And the Missouri evening primrose is just another one I like to throw in with this mix. It's, they're great in contrasting the colors against each other, and they're just really great for sidewalk plantings. Really like using these out at Shaw Nature Reserve. All right, a couple grasses real quick. Chinese maiden grass and fountain grass are both becoming more invasive throughout North America, and starting to see them pop up here and there around the St. Louis area where I am. Full sun, rough soil conditions, you can just stick them in the ground and they're going to grow just fine. And, that's one of the reasons why they become invasive in the long run, because they're such tough plants and adaptable to our soils. But a good replacement for Chinese silvergrass is our switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. And another one I didn't feature here, but I should have, was little blue stem. That's another really great plant for that more small to medium sized grass in a clump. And then prairie dropseed is a great native plant replacement for the fountain grass. It's got that same kind of feathery texture to it and little clumps. Winter creeper euonymus, an invasive ground cover that's highly used, still even in the trade now, but it's just smothers out everything in a understory woodland. But how people use it in their yards, a good way to replace this is if you have it in your yard and if it's growing up trees, that's how it spreads. So this picture here on the right, the plant just grows up the trunk of a tree and then flowers and fruits high up, and that's where the berries get dispersed from. If it's just down on the ground level, you can maintain it if you are on top of it and able to mow frequently or weed whip it, that kind of thing. But it is, again, if it's left unchecked, it's going to grow up trees and spread. So I highly recommend you removing it. But great plant replacement for this, if you have a customer or if you have it in your yard, a great plant for replacement for this is our golden groundsels. Pacra obovata is the one that's a little bit drier loving. We have quite a few different Pacras native to Missouri, but that's the one that you see here at the very bottom. It's got these round leaves, makes a nice ground cover, spreads by roots, and it's semi-evergreen. So just like winter creeper, which is evergreen, you'll be able to have some foliage year round. Pennsylvania sedge is another replacement for that, which spreads by root. It's going to give you that grassier texture, and that's that planting that you see here in the center area right here. So it's still short. It's going to have this, kind of more hairy texture to it, but it's not going to have any kind of bloom color. The Packer, on the other hand, not shown here in this picture, but it's got beautiful yellow flowers that actually are supportive of quite a few specialist bees. But those are two great replacements for that kind of woodland setting that you would have winter creeper in a yard. Two others that I would highly recommend for doing kind of mass plantings, not something I'd recommend for you just putting in a garden bed, but river oats or creek oats, as some might know it, or sea oats, that Casmantium latifolium, and beet grain grass, the Diarrhea ovovata. And both of these are great woodland grasses that can spread and keep weeds down and just outcompete a lot of other plants. So not necessarily something that you'd want in a garden setting, but if you had a setting like winter creeper, that's the kind of replacement you'd want, something that's going to be able to smother things out. So if you just have a big area that's shaded, that you're needing some erosion control, things like that, where winter creeper is already used, these are good replacements for that. So I want to give those warnings about using those in a more garden setting though. But for as a big ground cover, like you see in these pictures, fantastic. Definitely taller than winter creeper. These are both going to be about, in that 1.5 to 2.5 foot range. So, all right. And so we're wrapping it up here. I just want you to start thinking about how we can be a little bit more creative in replacing the plants that we're so commonly using in horticulture, right? Irises, combine geraniums, phlox, hibiscus. So many of these plants have native counterparts. So, that you don't even have to be that creative about, but we can easily replace them. They might not be as, varied in color or, a different variegation in a leaf, things like that. But it's more thinking about the fact that what purpose is this, doing for wildlife comparative to ourselves, comparative to, our need for eye candy. And so just trying to change these traditional ways of thinking in horticulture, in our changing our plant selections can help us prevent the next invasive species. And, is that visual trade-off of the showier blooms or foliage just really worth it? Are we gardening ethically? And I'm not saying get rid of everything, right? I'm not saying get rid of all the exotic plants. What I am saying is that there's a great medium. And this right here is a fantastic garden that you can go to in Chicago called the Lurie Garden, if you're ever in there, right in the middle of the city. It's a prairie style planting, which is about like 75% native plants, and quite a good use of exotic plants in there as well to fill in the color gaps of the season. Right here you can see some of these non-native onions that they have going, and it's completely well done. I highly recommend you going and seeing that if you're in the area. And so again, just want to finish this off by saying, I'm not saying get rid of all your exotic plants. I am saying get rid of your invasive plants. Just know the ecological value, of the plants that you are using, whether they're native or not, and try to learn how to identify the wildlife using your plants. So you're able to, speak, confidently about the plant choices you've made to others. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you. Here's some resources and online tools to help you with selection and care. Grow Native's website, of course, is great. They have a great plant finder on there, and the National Wildlife Federation has a great plant finder to tell you about plants that are native to your area by using zip code. But there's tons of other resources. Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder is a great one. Missouri Department of Conservation's got a great one too. So there's lots of great resources out there too, and I'm sure Carol can give you guys a lot of good lists. There's lots of great lists on Grow Native's website as well. These are two books that are great about talking about the things that we were talking about today. Midwestern Native Trees and Shrubs. That one talks about the replacement of non-native species itself. And then Native Plants of the Midwest is a great comprehensive list by Alan Bradenhagen. Excuse me. And some great places to get native plants in our area right here, as well as going on to Grow Native's website and finding them there. If you want to get in touch with me, this is my email, or feel free to follow me on Instagram, where I post a lot of content about native plants and ecology, or on Facebook and Twitter. I'm just not as active on there. And that is it.
Thank you, James. That was wonderful information. We do still have an incredible amount of questions. But some of these could maybe be answered quite quickly. There were several questions about the sale of invasive plants, and I might just answer that one if you don't mind.
You go right ahead.
So there were several questions about why are invasive trees and other plants, why do they continue to be sold? And the quick answer is there's a demand for them, but the information that James presented illustrates that, of course, there are many alternatives to invasive plants. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go to the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force website. That is moinvasives.org, and that is a group that is administratively housed through the Grow Native program. And there's a ranked assessment of 142 plants known to be invasive. And in fact, we have launched a project whereby we are asking more than 90 stakeholder groups how they would feel about ceasing the sale of some of the plants on that group. So we're currently seeking that input from groups, including horticulture groups, agricultural groups, and other groups. So you can find out more about invasive plants and that effort at moinvasives.org. So a lot of questions about some specific plants that maybe you can answer quite quickly. Mm-hmm. And again, I will say that, yes, you can find a lot of questions. If we don't get to them, there are questions about where to find a lot of these shrubs and trees. James presented some resources. Also go to grownative.org resource guide. And there's 148 different Grow Native professional members that sell native plants, do land care, sell native seeds. So for example, there's a question there about, do you know any local nursery that carries spice bush offhand? I don't know where this person lives, but if you go to grownative.org resource guide, you can find a map of retailers and find lists of those who sell plants and trees.
Yeah, I want to say too, spice bush is actually pretty readily available at most nurseries that carry a lot of native plants. It's not a hard one to find.
Great, thanks. There's a question here about which of the shrubs you mentioned would be particularly deer resistant. And as you're preparing your answer, James, I'll just say too, if you go to the native plant database at grownative.org, we've got more than 300 species of native plants. And it's searchable, and you can search on things like deer resistance. So that's a good resource for you, but James may have more information too.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's a pretty deep question. I mean, especially, like which one specifically. I covered a lot of plants. I will say
the shrubs. It was shrubs and trees.
Oh, the shrubs and trees. Okay. Well, I will say just right off the bat, resistant is the key word, because no plant is deer proof. It really depends on the area that you're in and how dense of a populated area for us, and how crammed in we are. So where I live, there's a park right nearby me, and typically deer don't eat bush honeysuckle around the St. Louis area, but when condensed into a tiny little park, because the suburban area surrounding the park is so tight and fenced in that they're even eating the bush honeysuckle. So it really is going to depend on the situation that you're living in. If you have a big piece of property, you're going to have an easier time planting native plants. If you're in an area where there's not much fencing, tight area, open lawns, where there's a lot of easy traffic coming through, any of your young plants that you plant in your yard, just be prepared to, protect them. Nothing's deer proof. You're gonna have to always, some of the things that are sometimes listed as like deer proof, like some, roses and things with thorns, like barberries, things like this. I've seen deer eat them, when they're hungry enough. And so just make sure that you're trying to protect them, and just really know the situation that you're in and understand like the deer population that's around you. Where I work currently at the Litzinger Road Ecology Center, a lot of the native plants that grow there naturally, like spice bush, things like that, they're not typically going after, but I can see them going after in a tighter enclosed area, right, where the food's less available to them. So planting a lot of plants, getting a wide variety of plants in your yard, not just selecting a small few, trying to go with diversity, you're going to have better luck in the long run with these plants. So I know that's kind of a not great answer giving you species, but a lot of the times it really doesn't depend on the species. And things that just, as a general rule of thumb that they don't go after are, things with thorns, stubby little branches, and things with a lot of scent to them. So something like spice bush. But again, male deer are going to rub their antlers on pretty much anything if you only have a couple little plants in your yard. They love rubbing their antlers actually on scented things that the other deer didn't eat. So it's not an easy question, but like Carol said, there's grow native lists of more deer resistant plants that you could try. But yeah, there's just not a one size fits all answer for that, unfortunately.
Thanks, James. A couple questions about willows, curly willows, and also pussy willows. Are they okay? I mean, in terms of, there's pollinators coming to them. What do you have to say about those?
Well, so neither of those are native to our area. I'm not actually sure of the origins of like the curly Q willow, of what species that is and like where it comes from. Pussy willow is actually, I believe, native to North America, but it's not native to our state. So it's just, there's just better options that you could have. If you already have those plants, again, they're not invasive in our area. So, if you have them already, you got them established, I'm not saying cut them down, but know if, it dies, you know, you could replace it with a native one, but I would definitely try to go with one that's as close to native to your area as possible. And not saying, you know, prairie willow is going to be the choose all plant for you either in the state of Missouri, because it's not native to the entire state of Missouri. So, you know, if you're really wanting to, you know, make these educated decisions, really look up the plants before you buy them, find out their home ranges, you know, before planting. And a good way to always find out what's, you know, what should be growing near you is to visit natural areas near you, you know, and make sure it's, you know, similar kind of habitat to where where you're living and growing. So if you're in an upland situation, try and find upland parks near you. If you're in a bottomland area, try and find, you know, wooded bottomland parks near you.
Thanks, James. Some questions about dogwoods. Is gray dogwood need wet or dry? What kind of soil does it take?
It's pretty versatile. It's typically going to be in a drier situation, though. If you want a dogwood for really wet conditions, I would go with our swamp dogwood, which is Cornus drummondii.
And how aggressive are gray swamp and rough leaf dogwood?
Say that one more time.
How aggressive are gray swamp and rough leafed dogwood?
Oh, so they can be fairly aggressive. They will be thicket forming. So I wouldn't plant them in the middle of your yard. You know, actually, a great place would be like in the middle of like a lawn area of your yard where you could mow around it, because they will send up suckers. So they colonize a small area. They're not going to be incredibly weedy in the sense of like popping up, you know, new seedlings near you, because the birds are going to eat the berries and carry them off. So they could poop them off, you know, poop out the seeds in your yard, or they could carry them off far away. But in a localized area, they are not going to be a great horticultural planting. But as a replacement for these invasive shrubs, they're going to be really good, because it's going to make a nice, you know, thicket barrier for you to not see your neighbors through. And I want to go back to, I think I said the wrong. So rough leaf dogwood, I believe, is Cornus drummondii. Sorry, it's late in the day. The swamp dogwood is Cornus ammonimum. So yeah, so there's options for the wetter conditions for that one.
Thanks. Would one need to have more than one native tree or shrub of the same species to produce berries, or will one tree or shrub suffice? For example, can one buy native prunus and expect it to fruit?
No, so most plants are not great at self-pollinating. They're just like us. We, you know, need to cross genetics to get a lot of viable fruit. Sometimes you will get some, you know, fruit on a self-pollinating plant. And then there's also going to be the twist of some plants are not, do not have both sexes of flowers on the same plant. A good example of this would be the spice bush that we've talked about quite a bit. There's male and female plants when it comes to that one. And that's not the only one. There's, you know, quite a few, like hollies are that same way. And so you would need a male and female plant to make viable fruit in those cases. But in the case of something like a cherry or plum that has both male and female parts on the same flower, on the same plant, you will still want to have multiple plants just to get better pollination, to get better fruit set. So even if a plant is able to self-pollinate itself by pollinators visiting its same flowers, you're still not going to get as good a fruit set as if you had multiple, you know, genetics of pollen crossing plants.
Thanks. Do all witch hazels hold leaves through the winter?
So no, so that's going to be just like me and you. They can be very variable in that. The Ozark witch hazel, which blooms now, it has a tendency to have it more often, but not all the time. You won't get it on every single plant, but it's got a tendency to do so more so. Virginiana is kind of the opposite. Sometimes you'll get it, some specimens that'll hold leaves, and sometimes you won't. But it seems like it's more the opposite, like it'll drop its leaves a little bit better. Some of the non-native witch hazels have been selected to have, you know, showier blooms and have the ability to actually have dropped their leaves. So if you see one that's got really showy, you know, big long confetti flowers, and no leaves on it, that's not one of our native witch hazels.
Thanks. Any suggestions on making native euonymus denser to be a better screen? I've seen Eastern Wahoo as a fairly tall and sparse shrub. It's lovely, but not a screen.
Correct, yes. So Eastern Wahoo is going to be more tree form. It's kind of, straddling that line like a viburnum of a small tree to a shrub. If you have it in any more open setting, it's going to get fuller and denser. So the more wooded the area, the more tree-like it's going to be. If you're able to, yes, ahead of time, as it's growing during the growing season, pruning it at its tips to kind of push back some of that growth and to kind of get it more shaped like that for you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and just a note on the dogwoods. So just a note, of course, Cornus Florida, the flowering dogwood, and Cornus alternifolia, the alternate. Those are, would you say those are more specimen, but the specimen type, good to plant alone. But the other ones, like you said, James, are more thicket forming, correct?
Correct, yes. Yeah, the shrub formed dogwoods are the ones that are more thicket forming. The other two are more specimen trees. Okay. And I wanted to say too, the other euonymus that we have, that strawberry bush, it is a little bit smaller in size and stature, and it's going to be shrubbier. So even if you wanted to prune on that one, you can actually get a really thick specimen with strawberry bush with a little bit of pruning.
How close do the plants need to be to cross-pollinate? Do they need to be right next to each other, or at least somewhere in your yard? I guess it depends how far the pollinators can travel.
Correct. So it really depends on the size of your yard. Bumblebees, if it's more reliant upon bumblebees, which some plants are, they can travel up to a few miles in their foraging. So, and that's not going to be great cross-pollination. So even if you had a piece of property that size and you had the plants on, that far end of your property, you're probably not going to get that good of pollination, just because it's very unlikely that bee, even though they can travel that far, it's very unlikely they're going to carry that pollen from one plant all the way to the other, but it's possible. But I would say if you have a small yard, an acre, 2 acres, something like that, anywhere on your property is going to be viable for the cross-pollination. Pollinators can travel pretty far in a localized area.
Okay, thanks. We're going to need to end it at 5:30, so just a couple more minutes. Try to get through more questions, and I am taking notes on questions that we might not be able to get to, and we'll try to send resources out. Brooke will send an email tomorrow with a recording and some of the resources that James mentioned and some other resources. So we'll just try to get through a couple more here. How amenable are all the shrubs that you talked about to pruning? Is there a succinct way to address that, James?
So I guess it just really depends on their description of pruning. If they mean like hedge trimming to like make them compact, most of these big, like larger shrubs are not going to be that great for something like that. They'll start to get funky shapes over time. But some of our smaller shrubs are a little bit more amenable to that. Now, when it comes to just like pruning out branches to shape them, most of them are pretty good about that. If their habit is more of a suckering plant, like some of our viburnums or our dogwoods, and they kind of thicket form, trying to prune them up into a tree, so like trying to prune a gray dogwood up into a tree form is a never-ending battle. So you will be trying to prune that up, and it's possible. I did it when I was working out at the Wildflower Garden at Shaw Nature Reserve with some of these plants, trying to just keep them into a tree shape to be able to just show that it's possible. But the maintenance on that is I'm pruning them, probably 3 to 4 times a year, just pruning off like suckers or, kind of water sprout growth, because they're trying to fight that, what I'm doing to them. So that just makes them higher maintenance. But if these are plants just being used as a screening situation, they don't probably need that much pruning. If you're pruning out dead wood, stuff like that, that's totally fine. But trying to fight them, trying to make them into a tree if they're a suckering plant, or by trying to hedge trim some of these very large shrubs, you're going to be upping your maintenance time by a lot on some of these plants. Anyway, and that's true of exotic plants too. If you got burning bushes or boxwoods, things like that, you're pruning them twice a year.
Thank you. We're at 5:30 now, so I think we need to we'll need to close at this point, but we'll try to get through send you some resources for some of the other questions we weren't able to get to. And James, you do have your email address there. So do you mind if, and Lauren Bloomis, I see you have a question. Maybe you could just email James directly. I apologize, but we're going to need to close now. And thank you all so very much. And thank you, James, for an incredibly important and well-organized and thoughtful presentation of really important information. Do tune in we have more webinars and master classes coming up through March and beyond. So thanks everyone. And thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you for having me.